Hello, UCLA Radio. This is Dr. No, and I am sitting right now. I am sitting with Governor Michael Dukakis, who ran for president in 1988 and is now a professor here at the Luskin School of Public Affairs. So let's get this started, and here we go. Well, Governor, from an early age, you were involved in the environment surrounding you. Like in school, you were an honor student. You played in the basketball, baseball, tennis, and cross-country teams. Became an Eagle Scout, and then after college, you served in the Army. Did experiences like these inspire you to pursue a career in politics?
Yes, but there were others as well.
Oh, okay.
For example, I had a third grade teacher named Mrs. Ripley, who for some reason decided to have an election for president and class officers in the third grade.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know why I ran for the presidency of the class.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know why my fellow students elected me, but I was elected president of the third grade class. So when I ran for the presidency, people said, "Now, what was the first political office you ever held?" And I said, president of the third grade class at the Baker School in Brookline, Massachusetts, Mrs. Ripley's homeroom. And you know, years later, when I became governor, I discovered that she was still teaching in the town of Groton, right up close to the New Hampshire border in Massachusetts. And called her and I said, "How would you like to bring your class down to meet the guy that you got started in politics?" And down they came. We had a wonderful visit. Teachers were important. My basketball coach at Brookline High School in Massachusetts was the first adult who said to me, "Someday, Dukakis, you ought to run for public office." Nobody ever said that to me. I had a French teacher, best teacher I ever had, named Kate O'Brien, who not only constantly encouraged me, and this was long after high school, but actually, when she died, left a bequest to me of $1,000 in her will, with the hope that I would run for the presidency of the United States. It was my first campaign contribution for the presidential campaign. My parents, obviously, though they weren't political activists, both immigrants came over from Greece and so on. But, you know, the CBS World News Roundup was always on at 6 o'clock at night. That's in the pre-television days. This was radio. So we were surrounded with a world in which you were expected to inform yourself, find out what was going on, and pay attention to what was going on in the world. And I think all of these things had an impact on me. No question about it.
Oh, okay. That's pretty cool. And having served in many political positions, from like a town meeting member to a contender for the presidency, I think it's safe to say that you've gotten the chance to see politics operate at various levels that most people don't really get to. What ways do you feel local, state, and federal politics are most similar and most dissimilar?
It's a good question. I started at the lowest possible level in local politics.
Mm-hmm.
You can't start any lower than being an elected member of the so-called representative town meeting in your town, Massachusetts. So I got a good look at municipal government from the ground level. And I think it was very important to me because, you know, we tend to be so focused on what's going on in Washington, we really don't understand, at least we don't stop to understand, that you have hundreds, thousands of good citizens who are deeply and actively involved in politics at the state, county, and local level, and who are all doing very good work, in most cases without the kinds of divisions we see in Washington these days. And those were that effort, that work, those efforts continue apace, notwithstanding what's going on in Washington. So the fact that I started there, that I had lots of experience at the local level and lots of respect for the folks that work hard at the local level, I think has been very important to me. Mm-hmm. And it's a constant reminder that it isn't just what happened in Washington yesterday that's so important. Mm-hmm. You've got literally thousands and thousands of people who are devoting themselves to making their communities or their states a lot better. Mm-hmm. And that's what public service is all about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so, continuing to speak about public service, you were elected governor of Massachusetts in 1974, correct?
I was.
Mm-hmm. Can you tell our listeners what your platform you're running is?
74 and the mid-70s were terrible years for the Northeast and the Midwest.
Mm-hmm.
They were calling us the New Appalachia. My state, when I was first elected, had the second highest unemployment rate. The country was 12.2%. Our older urban communities had unemployment rates of 20 to 25%. This was Depression stuff. And these old industrial communities, the textile towns, the shoe towns, places, centers of manufacturing, were just in a state of near collapse.
Mm-hmm.
So my dominant message from the time I started running for the governorship was, we got to do something to turn this around from an economic standpoint.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I was running in 1974 against a Republican, a good guy, thoughtful guy, who was the incumbent governor.
Oh, okay.
But when he was asked what he thought he could do for the economy, what a governor thought he could do, he said, well, there isn't much you can do. I mean, you don't have your own Federal Reserve Bank, you can't put together a fiscal policy, a budget policy that's going to fundamentally change things. My attitude was, I don't believe that. I think there are things we can do, especially in these older, very distressed, and mostly urban communities. But that was the challenge at the time. I mean, it was all about economics, all about what was happening with the economy of the Northeast and Midwest of this country. And it led to the creation of a coalition of Northeast governors. It led to I think probably the first targeted urban policy in America at the state level when I was governor. Then, of course, I got defeated in 78, came back and beat the guy that beat me in 82. And with that early experience under my belt, from 83 to 90, we really worked at this. And the difference in our cities was really pretty dramatic.
Okay.
So this was mostly about economic matters, but I was also a strong proponent, even at that time, of health care for working Americans and their families, and felt very strongly about it. And actually signed a bill which would have provided comprehensive health insurance for virtually everybody in the state of Massachusetts. This was 20 years ago, 24 years ago. Unfortunately, I was succeeded by a guy who was certainly bright enough, but just didn't understand health care and kept arguing that this would hurt businesses and so forth. When in point of fact, the businesses that were insuring were paying, in effect, for the guys that weren't when their people went into the emergency room, because that cost got thrown onto the backs of people that did insure their employees. And so we only were able to implement some of the bill that I signed, which was essentially a state copy of the Richard Nixon bill. And by the way, Nixon proposed a very good health insurance plan, which unfortunately died when he was impeached and subsequently left office.
If only he stayed just a little bit more. Yes. So you mentioned your successor and what's it called?
Bill Weld, yeah.
Oh, I was gonna ask if it was Mitt Romney. I'm
No,
a bit fuzzy about Miss Massachusetts.
And Romney, to his credit,
Mm-hmm.
Had the very sound, commonsensical idea that if we were spending hundreds of millions of dollars on free care in the emergency room for people that were uninsured, why not capture that money and turn it into health insurance for these folks so they could stay out of the emergency room, they could get comprehensive care, and we could kill two birds with one stone. And so Romney deserves a lot of credit at the state level for having done what he did. Unfortunately, as he began thinking about running for the presidency, the first time around, not the second, he started running away from his own plan, which was kind of sad, because today about 99% of the people in Massachusetts have decent and fairly comprehensive health care. And they're doing it with a state version of the Affordable Care Act. And believe me, it works. Now, we're still wrestling with cost problems, as is everybody else in this country. We're still paying double per person what every other advanced industrialized nation in the world pays for health care for their people. And by the way, they all have comprehensive and universal care. So we're at it. But if anybody wants to know whether or not this system works, all I have to do is come to Boston, and I'll be happy to give a guided tour. And until he started running away from his own plan, I thought Romney deserved credit for getting us going on a process which ended up with a pretty good health plan.
Okay. Yeah, so, well, would you say that health plan was your greatest accomplishment in your tenure, or is there anything else?
No, we did a lot of things. I mean, this turning the state economy around, working hard to revive those older, very depressed cities and regions, for that matter, focusing on the environment, passing the first comprehensive public education bill we'd had at the state level in years, making it possible for 15,000 single mothers on welfare every year to get a job and go to work. And I mean a good job, with training. It was the best welfare to work program in the country. I mean, there were lots and lots of things we did. And I'm very proud of it. But the challenge initially, and of course it continues, was to take this very sick state from an economic standpoint and turn it around. Mm-hmm. And I think I was able to do that, but it wasn't just Mike Dukakis doing it. It was a lot of folks doing it, a lot of people working closely with us.
That's good. Yeah. All right. And then so now we're going to move on to what's they called 1988, when you mounted your campaign for the presidency.
Yeah.
What convinced you to run?
You know, I'd never really thought of running, ever. I was happy doing what I was doing. We were making great progress in Massachusetts. We had turned things around. Now they were talking about the miracle of Massachusetts. And then the Iran-Contra scandal hit. And like a lot of other Americans, I was absolutely appalled. I couldn't believe it. It was the president, the vice president, lying to Congress, deliberately violating the law. Their staffs destroying documents in the basement of the White House. And I mean breaking the law that had just been passed by Congress. And doing it by helping Iran, of all people, making a profit on arms sales to Iran. Can you believe this? In the context of what we're now seeing. While providing support to the so-called Contras in this war in Nicaragua, which we insisted on getting into under Reagan and couldn't get out until finally the Nicaraguan people voted the Sandinistas out, but it had little or nothing to do with us. And I just thought the whole thing was an outrage. That's the thing that first started me thinking about running for the presidency.
Yeah, that's so cool. It's interesting because some people, they draw parallels between Iran-Contra and what's going on in Syria right now with the rebels rising against Assad. And like, there's like a lot of concern that some of the rebels are like not friendly to American interests. They might be extremist.
Yeah.
And so, do you feel those parallels are warranted or a significant difference?
Well, the Iran story goes back long before 1979 and the hostage taking and so on. In 1953, for reasons I still don't understand, the CIA engineered the overthrow of the democratically elected government of Iran under Mossadegh and restored the Shah to the throne. Now, what we were doing, promoting dictatorship, when in fact Iran had a relatively stable and interesting prime minister, who was no communist, let me tell you. He was a Sorbonne-trained lawyer and from the Iranian aristocracy. I don't know of anyone who doesn't think that had to be one of the dumbest things we've ever done. And it led directly to the current mess. So I am not a big fan of the U.S. running around the world intervening here, there, and everywhere, because the vast majority of these interventions have failed. In any event, we can't afford them. And I want to see this country of mine really working hard to build international peacekeeping institutions that can not only keep the peace, but make it unnecessary for us to go bouncing around from this crisis to that crisis, some other crisis. And I feel very strongly about this. That's why I like what my former lieutenant governor, who I trained as well as I could, John Kerry, is now doing in the case of Iran, with a lot of opposition. Trying hard to come up with a peaceful solution which is supported and endorsed by the UN Security Council, including Russia and China, interestingly enough. And that's where I think our efforts have got to go when it comes to foreign policy.
I see. Well, prior to receiving the Democratic nomination, you competed against such notable politicians as Jesse Jackson, Al Gore, and Joe Biden in the primaries. Can you tell us about that experience?
Well, they called us the Seven Dwarfs, present company excluded. I thought it was a pretty good field. And it gave me and all of us an opportunity to get to know each other. In fact, by the end of it, we had 45 debates. I made 39 of them. Well, when you debate the same guys 39 times, you can almost recite their lines for them. And we were kidding around about doing that. But it was a very good experience, and you learn from these folks. None of whom was a slouch, believe me. They're all interesting people, and good people. But my view was keep it positive, work hard, organize well, and see if you can put together a message that connects with people. And obviously, the one thing I had going for me was that I'd been a governor, was a governor, and was doing that in what was perceived to be a very successful state from an economic standpoint.
And well, what were some of the issues in the election that you?
Within the lieutenant governor, within the primary fight or the final.
Oh,
the final was all about. Look, nothing's changed. The single most important issue in any presidential campaign is the state of the economy. Mm-hmm. And at that time, the economy was mixed and was getting into trouble. I'm not sure people perceived it, but it was pretty obvious that we could not sustain the kinds of policies we had under Reagan. Mm-hmm. That sooner or later, the dam was going to burst. And the notion that you could run up a huge deficit and somehow stimulate the economy back to full employment while cutting taxes dramatically and yet restoring all that revenue through economic growth just didn't turn out. Now, don't get me wrong. I mean, when you go into a recession, government has to stimulate the economy in a variety of ways. Invest in infrastructure, put people to work, all this kind of stuff. But the Reagan economic policies were never going to sustain themselves over an extended period of time. And unfortunately, it was the guy that beat me, George H.W. Bush, that caught the brunt of the consequences of those policies when he served. It was one of the reasons, perhaps the dominant reason, why he lost to Clinton. But the economy was an issue. I was a strong proponent of universal health care. That was an issue. Protecting the environment, educating our kids, basic stuff. And not unlike today, involved lots of people.
Additionally, the Bush campaign drew attention to the fact that you opposed the death penalty, and they brought it up in a way to attempt to dissuade people from voting for you.
Right.
And it's considering that around 80% of Americans supported it at the time, and a majority still do. That was a really brave stance to take, and not only to take it but to defend it too before the public. Do you feel that issue hurt you in the election? Do you remain opposed to the death penalty?
I'm opposed to the death penalty. For one thing, there's no evidence that it's really a deterrent. I mean, people are still killing people. And secondly, it acts in a very arbitrary way. You look at the people that are sentenced to death, they're almost entirely poor, not always members of a minority group, but many are. People that can't afford a fancy lawyer, can't afford to pay the kinds of fees that people pay lawyers in the private sector. And so they may get decent representation for a public defender, they may not. They may know what's happening to them, they may not. And once you carry out the death penalty, it's irreversible, needless to say. And if you've made a mistake, and mistakes have been made, you can't bring that guy back. So for all these reasons, I'm not a fan of the death penalty, which doesn't mean that I don't believe in effective, focused law enforcement. And in point of fact, my state, both under me and many of my successors, had one of the lowest homicide rates in the country. Why? Because we're tough on guns, for one thing. And I believe we must be tough on guns. I think the notion that you've got a right to walk around with a concealable handgun under the Constitution of the United States is preposterous. And I'm not at all happy with the Supreme Court decision on the Second Amendment, because I'm not happy with this court generally. But we did a lot on the law enforcement and public safety side of things with very good results, frankly. And that without the death penalty.
That's good. And I don't know. It's just It's interesting to me because it just seems like a lot of Americans do it seems like in spite of labels like conservative, liberal, Americans still support the death penalty. I don't know why. It's curious to me.
Well, it depends on how you put it to them. If you ask them whether or not they support the death penalty or life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, those numbers change dramatically.
Mm.
And I think a majority supports life without the possibility of parole, which I do, for first-degree murder. So it depends on who's asking the question and what they're asking.
Mm.
Now, don't get me wrong. Most Americans, virtually all Americans, want to live in a safe neighborhood.
Yeah,
Don't want to be mugged walking down the street. They want their kids to be safe. And we're working very hard to do that. And in point of fact, violent crime in the United States is dropping very steadily. But I think the amount of time and energy we spend on the death penalty could be devoted much more effectively to other issues, other criminal justice issues. Not to mention the money that's spent on these death penalty cases.
That's true. Also, you picked Texas Senator Lloyd Benson as your running mate. What qualities did you feel Benson would bring to your ticket?
One of the best people in the United States Senate, had one of the best staffs in the United States Senate, had a very impressive record in the United States Senate. At the same time, was one of the earliest supporters in Texas in public office of civil rights. Voted against the poll tax, which was something most Southern members of Congress did not do at that time. And I thought, particularly coming in as a governor whose principal experience was at the state and local level, that it would be very important to have a running mate who was a veteran of the Congress, had real skill, and frankly, had I won, would have been asked by me to handle my congressional relations, because he was so good at that. And I think he would have been a terrific asset. But through no fault of his, let me tell you, I was not elected. Lloyd was a great running mate, good person, a good friend, and really did a terrific job as lieutenant governor. Lieutenant, why do I keep saying lieutenant governor? I keep flipping back on him as vice presidential candidate.
One of the most publicized incidents of the campaign was the Tane photograph taken by your campaign.
Right.
Many reacted negatively to the photo in spite of the fact that you had served in the military. So
Right.
why do you think people reacted to it the way they did?
Well, it was used in a way which I guess was intended to ridicule me. Of course, Bush had been in a tank 3 times. Should we have used that picture? I don't know. Look, one of the biggest, maybe the biggest mistakes I made in that campaign was to make a decision. It was my decision, nobody else's. I was not going to respond to the Bush attack campaign. And it turned out to be a terrible mistake. The other guy's coming at you. You just can't sit there mute. You've got to have a pretty well thought out strategy for dealing with his attack campaign, preferably one that turns it into a character issue on him. I mean, Bush went after me on this whole furlough program and Willie Horton and that kind of stuff. He was part of an administration under President Reagan, had the most liberal furlough program in America. They were furloughing people for 45 days. One of their furloughees went out and murdered a young pregnant mother in the Southwest. I never said that. Well, you know, if the other guy's coming at you with that kind of stuff, and you sit there mute, don't be surprised if at least some people begin to conclude that you're kind of soft on crime and you don't care about public safety and that kind of stuff. I mean, Bush had a terrible record on crime and public safety. Never done anything that was significant. And he came from a city, Houston, whose homicide rate, by the way, about the same size, Metropolitan Houston's about the same size as Metropolitan Boston. The homicide rate in Houston at that time was 6 times what it was in Greater Boston. I never said that either. Well, if you make the decision I made, then you simply do not respond to this kind of stuff. Don't be surprised again if at least some people begin believing it.
Well, so that's the thing I'll keep in mind if I ever run for public office. Yeah. And also, some major events happened after the election, such as the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Gulf War.
Right.
Do you think you might have handled events like these differently than Bush did?
Well, I certainly wouldn't have been in bed with Saddam Hussein as the Bush administration was. And the Reagan administration was. I mean, believe it or not, we were supporting Saddam. against Iran. How much sense did that make? We practically invited, under Bush, we practically invited Saddam to invade Kuwait. Our ambassador went in to see him and said, we have no security interest in Kuwait. Can you imagine that? Then she went on vacation. Not a surprise that the guy decided, well, if the United States tells me they have no security interest in Kuwait, then it's fair game for me, right? So I wouldn't have done any of that stuff. I thought this tilting to Iraq, the Iraq-Iran thing, was a terrible mistake. But you got to win first. And I didn't do that. Talking about the tank. Well, as I often say these days, but I've never thrown up all over the Japanese Prime Minister. You're going to make some mistakes in the campaign. Bush did, I did. But there were two really serious weaknesses in my campaign. One was that decision not to respond to the attack campaign. The other was not organizing every darn precinct in the United States of America, as I had always done as governor. But I spent too much time talking to people who I thought knew more than I did about how to run and win the presidency, and they all kind of poo-pooed the idea that we'd be out knocking on doors, 200,000 precincts around the country. It took Barack Obama to prove pretty decisively that precinct-based grassroots organizing works whether you're running for the presidency or running for dog catching. And I had it to do over again. That part of the campaign strongly emphasized.
Another label the Bush campaign tried to pin on you was a card-carrying member of the ACLU,
right,
given your defense of civil liberties.
Yeah.
Today, the ACLU was combating the NSA surveillance practices. What do you make of that whole development, the NSA spying?
You've just stated the truth. I mean, what's the organization that is most likely to be out there demanding that these kinds of invasions of our civil rights and civil liberties be stopped? It's the American Civil Liberties Union. By the way, a rather conservative organization in the true sense of the word, right? Because they believe in the Bill of Rights.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
They believe in the Bill of Rights,
yeah,
and they defend the Bill of Rights.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Bush was a card-carrying member of the National Rifle Association. And I suppose I should have said that a few more times than I did. But here again, the two reasons why I lost was, first, our grassroots organization was not what it should have been. And secondly, I made this decision not to respond to the attack campaign. It was just a mistake.
Yeah. Well, that's all we have about the election, but now we're going to move on to your time here at UCLA. And you, as I said before, you are a professor at the Luskin School of Public Affairs. What brought you to work here?
I was asked 20 years ago to come out and deliver a lecture, an annual political science lecture. And I came out. At that time, Northeastern University, where I teach the rest of the year, was on a quarter system. Mm-hmm. And having walked around the campus, delivered my lecture, and had a chance to meet people, I began hearing about this new school of public affairs, or public policy, I guess it was called. When I got back, I talked to my wife and said, what would you think if we spent, or tried to spend, January, February, and March in Los Angeles? And incidentally, all of our kids were in the West. We had a son at the time. We have a son who at that time was living with his family in Los Angeles. She said, that sounds good to me. So I reconnected with the university, and they asked me to come out and do some teaching, and I've been coming out ever since. This will be our 19th year.
And what specific topics do you teach as a professor?
I teach two courses. One, I co-teach with Professor Daniel Mitchell. It's called California Policy Issues. And it's a course that he's principally responsible for having put together first. But we've been teaching this now for 18 years. Have a lot of fun doing so. I think our students like the course. They're fully engaged. We bring in lots of guests so they can take a look at who is in public service these days. We encourage them to pursue careers in public service, encourage them to do the CAP program in Washington, do as many internships as they possibly can while they're going through UCLA. And it's really been a lot of fun. And I think if you talk to our students, they'll tell you that they really enjoy the course. That's undergraduates. Then I teach a graduate course in leadership. And these are two master's students who obviously have made the decision that they want to go into public service. So it's all about how do you get things done in the public sector? How do you develop the kinds of skills you need to make things happen? How do you build coalitions? All of those kinds of issues. And here again, a lot of fun. It's heavily case-oriented. But believe me, those two courses keep me very busy.
Oh, I see. Like I said earlier, UCLA. Oh, it's a story of UCLA. You're always busy. Something. All right, and well, I think I want to end like on a what's it called? On this note. What issues do you believe are the most significant?
At the local level, as I've said, the domestic economy always is a top issue. You know, the single most important domestic issue is, are we going to build a society in this country that provides genuine economic opportunity for every single American, and at the same time creates an environment in which people can work, earn, support themselves and their families, live in healthy, safe communities, and enjoy the best possible life, using their talents to the maximum possible extent. Internationally, I think we're at an important juncture in world history, and I'm not kidding. This may sound strange to you, but this is the most peaceful world I've ever lived in. Remember, I was a child of the Depression, then it was World War II, then it was Korea, then it was Vietnam, more recently, Iraq, Afghanistan. But what has happened is that increasingly, people are beginning to understand that we've got to rule out war as a means for settling disputes between and among countries. And that's happening. That's happening, despite all the noise, sound, and fury. That's happening. Doesn't mean that we won't have civil wars, that we won't have internal discord, that you won't have situations in Syria or Egypt or places like that are going to result in the loss of life and a certain amount of bloodshed. But as a means for settling disputes between and among countries, war increasingly is being ruled out by the world community. And I think that's a good thing. Now, how do you keep that going? By building strong, credible, peacekeeping institutions, international peacekeeping institutions. So if, for example, 6 countries in Asia are fighting over a bunch of worthless islands in the South China Sea, instead of either standing by or siding with one country or another, why aren't we saying to these folks, look, there's an institution called the International Court of Justice, the World Court. It was created precisely to solve these kinds of problems. If you've got a dispute about these islands, go to the World Court. Now, that does 2 things. First, you get a decision, peacefully. And secondly, it builds the credibility of the World Court so that subsequently others will go there. If we ignore it, or if we say, well, we're with Japan, even though Japanese policy these days is starting to bother me, then we don't build the kind of credible international institutions that we need to resolve these differences short of war and keep the peace. And yet, if you think about it, there are all kinds of places in the world where, thanks to UN presence and UN security forces, we've got peace where it probably wouldn't have developed. So that's what I want my country to be doing. Not naive, been in the military, I understand. But even the threat that we face today is one that has nothing to do with $12 billion supercarriers or F-35s at $100 billion a plane. I don't think Al-Qaeda is worried about F-35s or supercarriers. Do you? Hardly. So I think we're still in a kind of Cold War warp, spending hundreds of billions of dollars, by the way, on 837 American bases in 150 countries. Can you believe that? One, by the way, we need those funds at home, among other things. And I think that has got to be a major challenge for us, an important one. can we help with the other members of the international community to create a world in which you and your generation will no longer have to fear war, where there will be international machinery that can solve these problems. And I see us, notwithstanding a lot of noise, I see us moving in that direction. So a good, strong, prosperous America at home and a peaceful world in which the United States plays a major role in making sure that it is a peaceful world through international institutions, not by us jumping around and trying to be the world's sheriff. Those are, I think, the goals that your generation, I hope, will pursue and pursue successfully.
I hope so too. It's interesting because I think we saw that last August actually, when like a whole bunch of people, liberals and conservatives, came together to oppose going to war with Syria. I think that's really.
And by the way, as I said at the time, if ever there was a candidate for non-intervention, it was Syria. Not that I think the Syrian president is a wonderful guy.
Oh, yeah, of course.
But we did have an opportunity to move peacefully towards some kind of resolution of the problem when Kofi Annan was appointed as the UN mediator. But when we said, sorry, we will not have Iran at the table, in the conference that Annan had organized, when, as anyone knows, you cannot have a solution in Syria. You can't have a resolution of the Syrian problem without the Iranians being there. We said we wouldn't go if the Iranians were there, and Annan quit 2 days later. That's not the way you resolve differences. So I hope we're learning from these unfortunate experiences. I hope our focus is going to be on building good peacekeeping institutions that can solve these problems before they break out into armed warfare. Okay. And I'm confident we can do so. But the U.S. has to be leading that effort, not ignoring the Security Council when we invade Iraq, one of the dumbest things we've ever done, and other things like that. Or, for example, ignoring a decision of the World Court which said that what we were doing in Nicaragua was illegal, which it was. I mean, that doesn't build the credibility of these international institutions.
Or like Grenada or Panama.
Yeah.
All right, well.
We used to kid around about Grenada and said, why didn't Reagan invade Rhode Island? What's the answer to that question? It was too big. I mean, look.
Yeah.
U.S. invading Grenada, ridiculous. So, but I'm quite optimistic, and I'm quite optimistic about your generation going to work and making this happen. Wouldn't it be something, first time in the history of mankind, effectively to rule out wars and means of settling disputes between our countries? And we can achieve that goal. I'm convinced of it.
Yeah. Like I said, it seems that even the most hardline conservatives are realizing more. Is that all fun and games? It's a terrible thing.
Yeah.
I think that's encouraging. So yeah. All right. Oh, sorry.
Thank you for coming in.
All right. Thank you for having me,
Appreciate
Governor Dukakis.
Okay.
All right. That was Governor Michael Dukakis. He was governor of Massachusetts. He ran for president in 1988, and he's a professor here at the Luskin School of Public Affairs